morning, everyone. Good morning. Like a teacher every time. Thank you for braving the snow to join us this morning. Morning, we are officially on a hot mic, and it is quite sensitive, so keep all of your comments kind. The people on YouTube will hear what you say, and it is being recorded, so just bear that in mind. Thank you all for this. Is the third and final of the Town History Series lectures this year, so thank you to the West Bath Historical Society for providing us with our excellent speaker this morning. We're all very much looking forward to it, and a wonderful cap to it's been a great year. I've talked about it a little bit previously, but we are looking at ways to update the format of the Town History Series for next year, so be on the lookout for that. We have some plans, but it will be sticking around because it's the 22nd year and we'd like to make it to the 44th at least, so. Let's see. YouTube speakers on, that's the important part. That's most of it, and then I will let our wonderful speaker, Mark Linscomb, introduce himself.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks to all of you for turning out today. That goes both for the people who are sitting in the comfort of their home, watching, but in particular, I have to thank the brave souls who dug out from 4 to 5 inches of snow after last night's late winter storm to be here. I anticipated a majority of vacant seats, so I'm pleasantly surprised to see most of them are filled, so thank you again for that. As far as self-introduction, full disclosure, I'm what Mainers of my generation call someone who is from away. I am West Coast born and bred, and my wife and I have only been residents of West Bath for about 4.5 years. Being from away in Maine is likened to the feeling I had in the years that I spent living and working in Japan, where no matter how long you live there, no matter how hard you try to master the language and the culture, if you weren't born and raised in Japan, and particularly if you look like me, you were always and forever a gaijin, a foreigner. So being a resident of Maine from away is in a way like that, and yet thankfully in both cases in Japan and in Maine, people have been most welcoming to my wife and I. And in my defense, although we've only lived in West Bath 4.5 years, my connection to this part of Maine is somewhat longer. It was 55 years ago when I boarded a plane and flew out to Brunswick to attend college there. And then many years after that, and including time spent in Japan, we relocated to New England and were able to purchase a very modest second home on Orr's Island in Harpswell, which we owned for 16 years. So moving to West Bath has been less of an adventure and more of a homecoming, I would say, to both of us. If there's one theme that echoes throughout the collection of history books in the Patton Library on the topic of human settlement here in Mid-Coast Maine, it's the vital role played by the nation's waterways, by the region's waterways. If you type in the name Kennebec River into the library search engine, it yields more than a dozen titles. This is just a sampling, the first 2 pages. Conversely, I've yet to find a book on the history of Bath that failed to describe the Kennebec as a defining feature of the city's economic development and its very identity as the city of ships. Similarly, no history of Brunswick would be complete without citing the importance of the Androscoggin River, Maquot Bay, and Middle Bay, or in the case of neighboring Harpswell, Middle Bay and Harpswell Sound. I mention these 3 municipalities because all 3, Brunswick, Harpswell, and Bath, prior to the founding of West Bath in 1844, bordered another waterway that receives far less attention in the history books, the New Meadows River. This oversight seems odd to me, considering that since colonial times, the New Meadows has figured prominently in Mid-Coast maps. It marked the western border of Georgetown from June 1738 until January 1781, when Bath was incorporated as a town. On the map on the left, you can see that the border between Cumberland and Lincoln counties from 1760 to 1853 was also marked by the New Meadows, although on this map, you can barely see it down here at the edge, marking between Cumberland and what was then Lincoln counties. And it has marked the border between Cumberland and Saginaw counties, as you can see on the map on the right, ever since 1854. That said, these maps also reveal the diminutive size of the New Meadows River when compared to the neighboring Kennebec and Androscoggin rivers, which may account for its diminutive stature in the history books. In case you can't see it, the New Meadows is right down here compared to the Androscoggin and the Kennebec and the Androscoggin rivers. The Kennebec, after all, cuts a 170-mile long swath from Moosehead Lake to Casco Bay. It boasts a maximum depth of 40 feet at long reach and links a dozen communities that arose along its shores. Not to be outdone, the Androscoggin extends some 178 miles from Umbagog Lake in New Hampshire to Merrymeeting Bay. It too reaches a maximum depth of 40 feet, and it too connects a dozen cities and towns. In contrast, the New Meadows River is a mere 12 miles long, and it flows today past just the four towns of Brunswick, Harpswell, Phippsburg, and West Bath. Its very name may have contributed to its obscurity. On some 18th and early 19th century maps, it was labeled the Stevens River, while on other maps it carried both names, literally Stevens or New Meadows River. But either name is misleading, of course, because as you probably know, it's not a freshwater river. It is a saltwater embayment with tides of 9 to 10 feet and an average depth in the main channel of around 23 feet. At this point, then, you may be wondering, why have I chosen to focus today's presentation on a river that is not a river and which has attracted so little notice among historians? So in keeping with the long tradition of this annual town series, my original aim was to rescue the New Meadows from obscurity by highlighting its role in the economic and social development of my town of West Bath and its forebearer, the city of Bath. However, during my research, I came to realize that Bath's and West Bath's early development on the eastern shore of the New Meadows occurred in tandem with development along the western shore in Brunswick and Harpswell. While each of these communities has developed a distinct identity, historically they are also part of a larger, albeit unofficial, New Meadows River community, as I call it. Now, to support this claim, I would like to first share a few nostalgic recollections of this community, which were published during the first half of the 20th century. In 1900, the Lewiston Journal Company published a novel titled A Romance of New Meadows, which, by the way, is the only book in the patent library with the name New Meadows in the title. The author, Emma Frances Harmon Raymond, who hailed from the inland town of Harrison, Maine, remarks in the preface that she found inspiration for her novel, quote, while sojourning for a short period of time on the Maine coast and becoming somewhat familiar with the manners and customs of the coast people, unquote. Now, it must have been an eventful sojourn because, considering that her marriage to Grosvenor Waterhouse Raymond in 1888 took place in Harpswell, which is also where Mr. Raymond died and was buried the year after her novel was published.
Oh.
Also, Emma, who died in 1944, is listed in the US Census for 1930 and 1940 as a widow residing in Harpswell. In any event, chapter 1 of her novel begins, little does the summer visitor think as he goes bowling along the electric road from Brunswick to Bath, that years ago there was a prosperous village near what is now called Harding Station. This was before Bath was the city of today, and here centered a large part of the commerce and trade of the surrounding country. As we look out across waving grain and sweet-scented clover fields, we can hardly realize that here lived and loved, toiled and gained wealth, or sunk in poverty, a people much the same as do those of our rural villages of today, only under more crude and primitive surroundings, but with much the same feelings and aspirations that have come down to us, unquote. Apart from this single reference to Harding Station, which is near the site of today's Skillins Garden Center at this intersection of Harding Road and Bath Road. Aside from that, the author's occasional references to Foster's Point on the eastern shore and to Howard's Point on the western shore indicate to me that she was describing a community which bridged the New Meadows River. Her eulogy for a forgotten past includes the river itself in the form of a 4-line poem that opens chapter 4. Fair river, few have sung thy praise. Unknown thou murmurest to the sea, but from the far-off golden days, I hear these echoes come from thee. 39 years after the publication of A Romance of New Meadows, the June 29, 1939 issue of the Brunswick Record carried a timely article that revisited the town's past on the eve of Brunswick's bicentennial later that week. The unnamed writer observed that, quote, at the New Meadows River, there was a time when settlers considered themselves vastly more important than the few who had clustered under the protective wings of the fort at the falls of the Androscoggin. Known as Harding Station, the section about the New Meadows has curiously been more closely identified with Bath than Brunswick. Even today, this is true, although the domain of the town of Brunswick stretches to the New Meadows. In the little cemeteries along the Harding Road sleep numerous men whose names appear in the annals of Brunswick. They were soldiers, farmers, businessmen, leaders in community politics. To neglect them because an accident of geography removed them some 6 or 8 miles from the center of the community they helped to build is unreasonable. That they are neglected is shown by the lack of care accorded their graves, covered by years of brush and growth, the stones left lying in mold. Unquote. My final example comes from Isabel P. Congdon, a local historian whose 21-page booklet, Indian Tribes of Maine, was published by the Brunswick Publishing Company in 1961, but Congdon herself was better known for her occasional columns in the Brunswick Record, including one that appeared in the August 4th, 1949 edition under the title New Meadows of Bygone Days. I'd like to share her vivid description of the communal life that existed in, quote, a not too distant past when that part of the river was the meeting ground for a great many Brunswick and Bath people who had boats along the waterfront. 40 years ago, it was the scene of a continuous water carnival, with many private pleasure boats heading up and down the river on a Sunday afternoon. The trolleys then connected with the city of Bath and Brunswick, and hundreds of those who had no private boats might charter one for a sail. Along the riverbank, picnickers disported themselves, and salesmen of soft drinks, sandwiches, and potato chips did a lively business. Excursion boats plied regularly to Gurnet, where connections could be made to Portland, and en route, shore dinner places catered to large parties all day long. Trim cottages, then as now, dot the banks of the New Meadows, but they have an air of detachment and privacy, which was lacking in the good old days, when one skirted in a pleasure boat so close to the banks that you could smell what the occupants were having for dinner. The New Meadows was a hard river to navigate, but thousands of boat lovers did it. Not until you reached Foster's Point on the further bank did you get a real whiff of seagoing. Still, it was a well-plied watercourse to the ocean, and no one except a sissy went off for less than a full day's sail to Gurnet and under the Gurnet Bridge to Harpswell, unquote. Apart from their fond recollections of a community centered around the New Meadows, each of these writers eulogized a different era of economic growth and social solidarity. Emma Raymond, the novelist, harks back to the far-off golden days, leaving us to wonder when exactly. The 1939 newspaper article provides a stronger hint. The writer refers to the fort at the falls of the Androscoggin, which we know was built in 1688 and rebuilt in 1715. But the writer also goes on to laud the contributions which residents living along the New Meadows made to Brunswick's subsequent development. And for Isabel Congdon, writing in 1949, the good old days occurred 40 years earlier, around 1910. So as I hope to show today, the historical record reflects a similar pattern of community development, which, like the river that is not a river, has ebbed and flowed over the centuries. Apart from the musings of these writers, what prompted me to widen the scope of my research beyond Bath and West Bath to encompass Brunswick and Harpswell was a pronounced demographic shift in the population of Bath during the 18th century. Those history books, which I alluded to earlier, all agree that the first European colonists to arrive in this area settled on the banks of the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, and Merrymeeting Bay, as shown in this map, titled, this map. Let's see here. Sorry. The first settler is said to be a fellow named Thomas Purchas, who I think his name does not actually appear on this map because his area of occupation was along the Androscoggin River in what is now Brunswick. He was a fur trader turned commercial fisherman from Devonshire, England, arriving in 1628 and plying his trade along the Androscoggin between the falls and Merrymeeting Bay. Purchase was followed by Christopher Lawson, whose property is located up here, who one historian has identified as the first settler within the present limits of Bath, having purchased a plantation in 1640 from an Indian Sagamore at Chops Point. Third was Alexander Thwaite, who arrived about 1654, and Reverend Robert Gooch and his family in 1660. The only settlers known to live in the vicinity of the New Meadows River were Alistair Coombs, who resided on the western shore from 1665 to 1675 without a land title, before disappearing without a trace, and the better known Thomas Stevens, who settled at the head of the river by 1675 on lands he purchased from 3 Indian Sagamores and from Thomas Purchas, and whose name, Stevens, has become synonymous with the river ever since. This demographic pattern persisted over the next 60 years, even though the size of the population waxed and waned as many settlers were either killed or fled during the so-called French and Indian Wars that began in 1675. Now, the New Meadows seeming anonymity is perplexing because the largest tracts of land belonging to settlers like Reverend Gooch actually extended from the Kennebec west all the way to the New Meadows, and yet nobody apparently decided to live on the New Meadows. In any case, the historian Owen states that, quote, up to about 1714, no one had lived along the east shore of New Meadows River and Casco Bay above Small Point Harbor, unquote. Now, fast forward a mere 36 years from 1714 to 1750, and we see a significant increase in the number of homesteads along the previously uninhabited eastern shore of the New Meadows, as indicated on this 1750 map. This, of course, being the New Meadows here. And in talking about the New Meadows, we were also talking about Mill Cove and Broad Cove because it's their tidal waters that furnish water to those areas. Owens and other historians credit the entrepreneurial drive of one Joseph Barry with helping to spearhead this belated development along the New Meadows. Barry's, you can see there a list of names that the map maker has included, and Barry Mills' home on the Cove is right down here. His contributions are immortalized in the road that still bears his name, Barry's Mill Road. The farmland that he purchased around 1739, 1740 bordered today's Mill Cove, which Mr. Barry astutely concluded was the perfect site to build a sawmill powered by the daily tides of the New Meadows River. He constructed a second sawmill in 1749 at Sears Cove, and in 1750, with others, a grist mill. Barry and others built a third sawmill in 1763, a fourth in 1782, and his second grist mill in 1783. His compound, where he also operated the area's first tavern and inn, soon attracted other settlers, going back to that map. As you can see, he's now been joined by a number of other settlers here, who likewise built tidal mills in the vicinity. In 1806, a fifth sawmill was built. In 1812, the Ring, Winter, and Mitchell families teamed up to build a fourth grist mill on Mill Cove, and Philip Higgins built one on his property in Back Cove. Further north, up here, John Lamont, an Irish immigrant and bricklayer by trade, arrived in the area around 1722 and in 1736 settled on the eastern shore of the New Meadows, near where the present railroad crosses. Working at that location, Lamont helped inaugurate the shipbuilding industry in Bath, where he built sloops for the coastwise trade and the West Indies trade beginning around 1745. His sons carried on this craft following his death in 1766. Such was the growth in population in what is today West Bath that, according to one estimate, by 1772, 1773, roughly 34% of the population of Bath lived on Longreach, on the Kennebec. 30% lived at Mill Cove, 20% along the New Meadows River, and 16% down at Foster's Point. Now, without wishing to diminish the contributions which these and other settlers made in marshaling the resources of the New Meadows River for the development of Bath during and after the 18th century, to get a fuller appreciation of that history, we need to widen our focus, a vision to include Brunswick and Harpswell on the opposite shore. If we take another look at this map, this being the western shore of Brunswick now, we see that the map maker, John North, plotted about the same number of homesteads on the western shore as on the eastern shore. And turning to an earlier map from 1738, we see that the settlers along the western shore already outnumbered their counterparts. Just to give you some orientation here, so this is Macquot Bay over here in Muir Point, the southern part of Brunswick. Here, of course, is the nascent main, what would eventually become the center of Brunswick proper. Here's the Androscoggin River, here's the fort, and then you work your way down to Merrymeeting Bay. Stevens Carrying Place, named after Thomas Stevens, Carrying Place being where the Native Americans used to haul their canoes from the Merrymeeting Bay over to New Meadows. And all along here is the New Meadows River, titled here Stevens River. And you can see the number of towns that extend all the way down to what I believe is the border between Brunswick and Harpswell. An interesting sidelight is I noticed that the river is called the Stevens River. Way down here, where Brunswick meets, where the Brunswick and Harpswell town lines meet, the author has written in New Meadows. If, as Owen claims, no one inhabited the eastern shore of the river in 1714, that year to me nevertheless marks the real beginning of the larger New Meadows River community. Because in November of that year, a group of wealthy urban elites, 7 from Boston and 1 from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, known as the Jebscott proprietors, acquired the property rights to land stretching east from Macquot Bay to the Kennebec River and south from Merrymeeting Bay all the way down to Small Point. The following year, their claim was validated by the Massachusetts General Court in return for a promise to lay out, if the land would admit, 4 plats or towns, including a fishing village, fishing town at Small Point. The proprietors pledged, in turn, that, quote, in 7 years, if peace continues with the Indians, we would settle each of said towns with 50 families or more, in a defensive manner, having already offers of very considerable numbers, both in this country and from England, unquote. To that end, the proprietors would grant such house lots in fee and such accommodations in regard to their lands as might induce them to settle there. And land would also be set aside in each case for the first minister, the ministry, and a school. Now, settlement proceeded slowly at first, and the fishing village at Small Point was abandoned after a few years. Nevertheless, the proprietor's vision eventually resulted in the founding of Brunswick, Harpswell, and Topsham townships. Whatever plans the proprietors may have had for land lying between the New Meadows and the Kennebec rivers were probably thwarted when it was absorbed by Georgetown in 1753, and in the face of competing land claims from a rival group of Boston-based businessmen, the Kennebec proprietors, beginning in 1759. That said, it's not hard to imagine, even looking at this map, how the Jebscott proprietors' efforts to populate Brunswick and Harpswell encouraged other newcomers like Berry, Lamont, Ring, Mitchell, and Higgins to settle nearby on the eastern shore of the New Meadows. As noted in the proprietors' plans to lay out their homes in a defensive manner, a major concern among all settlers was the continued threat of Indian attacks, which placed a premium on communal defense. The threat transcended nascent, still ambiguous municipal boundaries, as demonstrated by events in 1722 during the Lovewell's War, when Indians attacked Fort George in Brunswick, homesteads at Longreach, the fort at Small Point, and the village of Georgetown itself. According to Owens, outside the small zone under the protection of fortified houses, all the settlements were laid waste and both people and cattle either killed or carried away. Thus, we find that as late as the 1750s, settlers like Joseph Berry down on Mill Cove and John Lamont up on the northern reach of the river, they all built fortified blockhouses on their property to provide refuge for their families and their neighbors along the New Meadows. An early poignant example of the intertwined lives of New Meadows neighbors on both sides of the river occurred in July 1751, when Hezekiah Purrington, who lived on the Purrington farm on the eastern shore just below today's railroad bridge, crossed the river in his canoe to visit members of the Hinckley, Lombard, and Whitney families who were cutting hay in a field on the Brunswick side. A surprise attack by a party of 19 Indians and one Frenchman led to their capture and imprisonment in Canada, except for Isaac Hinckley, who attempted to escape and was shot and killed. As the threat of further conflict with the Indians lessened after the mid-1750s, this is when development really began in earnest. Today, along either shore of the New Meadows, one could still see vestiges of the once numerous farms that inspired the river's current name. Those early farms grew up in tandem with two cottage industries that I've mentioned earlier, milling and shipbuilding. In 1753, 3 years after Joseph Berry had erected his first grist mill at Mill Cove, 4 men from Brunswick and 1 from Georgetown pooled their funds and labor to construct a grist mill on the Brunswick side of the New Meadows. According to historians George and Henry Wheeler, by 1753, there were no less than 6 sawmills in Brunswick, 3 of which were on the New Meadows River. A corn mill was built on the Brunswick side by 1795. Now, back during the 17th century, along with fishing and fur trading, logging was one of the principal sources of revenue attracting the first Europeans to the Kennebec and Androscoggin valleys, due in part to the English Navy's insatiable demand for masts and spars for its warships. Thereafter, as the Massachusetts Bay Colony extended its control over the region and issued patents to businessmen such as the Penobscot proprietors in order to establish self-sufficient tax-paying farming communities, the demand for tidal sawmills grew. Why? Because in return for a grant of land of 100 acres, newcomers to Brunswick were required to build a dwelling on their lot within the first year, and to improve their lands for the term of 3 years or face forfeiture and eviction. This meant clearing the land of trees as soon as possible and accessing the lumber needed for construction. In addition, lumber remained in the 18th century a source of income for the new arrivals, who were hard-pressed to grow the crops necessary to feed their families and pay off their debts in Maine's rocky soil and harsh climate. In 1739, for example, the proprietors agreed to allow poor settlers to send the pay for their lots in wood or timber to Boston at no charge in lieu of money. And so valuable was this form of currency, lumber, that proprietors had to issue repeated warnings to farmers against illegally cutting timber in unoccupied lots. As this last statement indicates, the market for Maine's timber products extended well beyond Maine and even Boston. Settlers along the New Meadows utilized the river's resources to engage in this trade, which sent masts, spars, shingles, staves, and barrels to the southern colonies and to the West Indies. This trade in turn required the construction of wooden seagoing sloops, schooners, and brigs. While the aforementioned John Lamont is credited with building the first ships on the New Meadows, he was soon joined by others on both sides of the river. The best known and most enterprising of these inhabitants was Captain John Peterson, who had his hand in all three ventures, milling, shipbuilding, and trade. Born in Duxbury, Massachusetts in 1743, Peterson and his 11 children moved to Brunswick in 1783, where they lived in a two-story house that he built at Howard's Point. Howard's Point being on the left here, looking from south to north. Peterson, and we're not entirely sure where his house is located. And I'll show you some other photos later to give you a better idea, but it was somewhere around this area here. He eventually operated and built a grist mill, a double sawmill, and 2 shipyards on the New Meadows. We know that a sawmill and grist mill were located here in what's called Thomas Bay. If you know where Thomas Point Beach is, that's there. The location of the second shipyard is still uncertain, but one local historian, William Purrington, places it on this side, on the east side of Howard's Point, directly across from what is today West Bath. In addition to all these, Peterson owned 2 stores and is said to have used his house as an inn, so he's quite the entrepreneur. Historian Malcolm Hamilton lists 8 vessels that came out of Peterson's shipyards in Brunswick between 1784 and 1796. There were 4 sloops, 4 schooners, 1 sloop, and 3 ships. Among the largest was the ship Polly, 166 tons and 75 feet long. Peterson used some of these vessels to conduct trade with the West Indies, exporting local products like lumber and returning with cargoes of sugar, molasses, and rum, which, according to historian Levi Lamont, were carried by oxen from the New Meadows River to Brunswick and Bath. It is also believed, this will give you a better view of his probable location, it's also believed that the customs house was located at Peterson's house on Howard's Point. So here, I think, Peterson's house is probably located about here. There's a clearing on what is today Adams Road, and this is the view overlooking it. So over here is West Bath. You can see how close the two. So here is the dividing line between Cumberland and Lincoln counties, and now Cumberland and Saginaw counties. This being the main channel of the river, and one can imagine, and at this point, that's all I can do. Peterson residing here on top of the hill, with shipyards on this side of Howard's Point, and here perhaps directly below him, where there's a very large cove that would certainly been a great location for incoming ships to stop in order to register their cargoes with him, and perhaps also his shipyard, but I have no absolute proofs of that. And many times I have kayaked past that area looking desperately for some signs in the water and haven't found any yet, but I haven't given up. Peterson's most ambitious project was the ill-fated canal that bears his name. The idea for this project came from a resolution adopted in the 1786 Brunswick Town Meeting to dig a canal between the New Meadows River and Merry Meeting Bay. That same year, 98 residents of both Brunswick and Bath teamed up to petition the General Court of Massachusetts for permission to dig such a canal. Permission was granted in 1790 and 1791, and construction was completed around 1792. But the reason it was ill-fated was, of course, while Peterson himself ran logs from Merry Meeting Bay through the canal to his mills on the New Meadows, it was eventually abandoned because the difference in the daily tides between the two bodies of water meant that it could be only used for a few hours each day. Now in 1797, Peterson relocated to Longreach on the Kennebec, where he built and owned 5 more vessels between 1798 and 1806. But his departure did not spell the end of shipbuilding on the New Meadows. According to Levi Lamont, Joshua Shaw built a sloop at Mill Cove in 1781 and a schooner in 1783. David Ring and Albert Mitchell also built a brig at Mill Cove about 1785. And according to historian William Rowe, in Harpswell, Joseph C. Giving had an active shipyard on the river where between 1848 and 1867, he built at least 7 vessels, 2 ships, 2 barks, 2 brigs, and a schooner. The largest, the ship Marcia Greenleaf, was built in 1855 and registered 1,177 tons. This is a pretty big ship. Nor did the business of shipping on the New Meadows suffer from John Peterson's move to Longreach. Historian William Baker refers to an advertisement from 1814 when privateers were capturing American ships during the War of 1812, which announced that the sloop Friendship would run a packet. A packet is simply a regularly scheduled ship that runs from one port to another. That would run a packet from Portland to Harpswell, Brunswick, and Bath via the New Meadows River instead of going up the Kennebec, and continue until she got permission to go around Small Point and on to Hollowell and Augusta as usual. After that war, beginning in 1820, Brunswick ran packets to Portland, Boston, and the southern states from the New Meadows, as well as Middle Bay and Macquac Bay. According to William Purrington, much of Brunswick's and Thompson's merchandise for the traders was landed at Cushman's Wharf and Brown's Wharf on the New Meadows. Lumber from sawmills operating at the falls of the Androscoggin River was also loaded onto packet vessels at Cushman's Wharf. My research also turned up brief references to other early commercial ventures along the New Meadows. In 1774 and throughout the Revolutionary War, John Barry and David Shaw made salt at Mill Cove. During this period, Benjamin Shaw of Roxbury, Massachusetts, and John Bakeman of Castine were likewise engaged in the business on the Brunswick side of the river. Limestone was also quarried, heated in kilns to produce lime and then shipped out on vessels. Robert Jordan built the first lime kiln at New Meadows in 1800, and Reverend Samuel Woodward also had a quarry, and his kiln was located near the New Meadows Baptist Church. Turning to the 19th century, granite was quarried on the western side of Howard's Point, where it was loaded onto vessels similar to the schooner M.M. Hamilton, and was shipped from there to Portland, Boston, and other destinations. Purrington recounts an incident that occurred in the late 19th century involving a vessel that had taken on a load of granite at the Old Stone Pier at Howard's Point. Due perhaps to foul weather, as the vessel approached the mouth of the New Meadows, somewhere in the vicinity of Cundy's Harbor, the cargo must have shifted because it capsized and sank. Meanwhile, over in West Bath, as our long-serving archivist, Carrie Nelson, reported in the West Bath Historical Society's newsletter, Mr. Levi Houghton from the Houghton Brothers shipping firm in Bath purchased a 40-acre parcel in the Sabino district in 1880, which included a low swampy area. The enterprising Mr. Houghton had a dam built on one end of the swamp and converted it into an 18-acre pond where he produced and harvested about 25 tons of ice each year. The blocks of ice were covered in sawdust and stored in his ice house on the shore of the New Meadows until they could be loaded onto barges at his dock and shipped to Portland, Boston, New York, and beyond. Mr. Houghton oversaw the business from 1883 until his death in 1895. A river can serve to connect communities on either shore, but it can also act as a barrier separating them. In their successful petition to the Massachusetts General Court in 1753 to establish the second parish of Georgetown, residents of the future town of Bath pleaded that, quote, they labor under the greatest difficulties in attending the public worship of God in Georgetown, in that they not only live remote from thence, but are obliged to cross Winnegans River, at least 3/4 of a mile, where the tide is very rapid, and the ice in cold seasons in very large quantity, by means whereof the ancient people, women and children, can scarce ever attend the public worship of God, so necessary to their well-being, unquote. Over on the New Meadows, folks use various methods to straddle the river and maintain connections with their neighbors on the opposite shore. Boats of varying shapes and sizes, from Hezekiah Purrington's canoe to the skiffs that brought the star-crossed lovers from Foster's Point and Howard's Point together in Emma Raymond's romance novel, to John Belmont's coastwise sloops, all were frequent sight long before Isabel Congdon's Carnival of Pleasure Boats arrived on the scene. In a notable counterpoint to those who feared crossing the Winnigan's River in order to worship in Georgetown, some of the faithful in Harpswell rode across the New Meadows to Sabino, then walked up the hill to attend Sunday service at the West Meeting House, which was built in 1839 on Barry's Mill Road, and which is now maintained by the West Bath Historical Society. Benjamin Brown operated a ferry across the river from the early 1760s until 1792 between a point of land just below the house of our friend John Peterson at Howard's Point and King's Point on the opposite shore. Here's, you can see a close-up of the landing over on Howard's Point. And this shows the distance between that landing and King's Point, where the ferry crossed. At the request of the town of Brunswick, Peterson agreed to continue operating the ferry until a bridge was built in 1796. As can be seen on, perhaps, I hope, on this map from 1764, and it's very hard to see, I admit, Brown's Ferry, this again, I assume is the general location of Peterson's home. And this is the road, or I should say the pathway that goes down to Brown's Ferry's landing. As you can see, it intersected with the old county road from today's Cook's Corner. And in case you're wondering where the name Cook's Corner came from, at this stage, there is one house belonging to a Stephen Cook over here. And this is the old county road that was now going to be intersecting with the new county road, also sometimes known as the New Meadows Road, that would go up eventually to Harding Station. And a couple of other interesting facets of this map, which is part of the Pejebscott proprietors' records, is you can see the ways in which the proprietors allocated the plots of land that were then sold off to hopeful permanent residents. And you can also see the number of houses that already are located in 1764 along the New Meadows River, as opposed to those in what eventually would become the center of Brunswick. And by the way, here it is noted that the name of the river is again noted as the Stevens River. Let's see here. So the ferry, what's interesting about the ferry and the subsequent bridge is it allowed travel between Cook's Corner and Brunswick over to Bath. And during the early 19th century, this route, and again, I apologize because this map is very hard to read from here. This route, known locally as the Shun Pike, which is right here. And on this map is dated from 1760. This road, known as the Shun Pike, enabled travelers to bypass the so-called King's Turnpike just above it, which was a for-profit toll road built by future Governor William King and a group of Bath investors to connect Brunswick and Bath. In 1842, the new Bull Rock Bridge became the main artery linking Brunswick, Bath, and West Bath. The wooden bridge is built and maintained by the city of Bath. The rock used for the stone abutments and piers came from Thomas Point and from the area around the site of the first parish meeting house on Barry's Mill Road. Unfortunately, in the spring of 1850, the bridge was lost to ice and water and wasn't rebuilt for 12 years until 1862. And over time, the bridge deteriorated, and in 1907, it finally collapsed under the weight of a team of horses pulling a load of bricks. Yeah. Writing in 1877, the Wheelers concluded their historical overview of Brunswick's commercial development as follows, quote, "The most prosperous period in the history of the town, unless the present may be called so, was undoubtedly between 1820 and 1850. The eastern part of the town, New Meadows, was at this time gaining rapidly in commerce and fisheries. For the 3 years between 1820 and 1824, the number of buildings erected in the village was 64. Probably this was as large a number in proportion to the population as has ever been erected here within that space of time. Of this number, 23 were handsome dwellings and 7 were stores. The remainder were mechanic shops, etc. Unquote. I think we can refer to these decades as the high tide of economic development, not only for Brunswick, but also for the larger New Meadows River community. Thereafter, the tide slowly ebbed during the mid-19th century. The shipping trade along the river suffered from the completion of the Portland and Kennebec Railroad in 1849. Shipbuilding on the eastern shore had already moved from the New Meadows over to the Kennebec River, while in Brunswick and Harpswell it centered on yards on Naquat Bay and Middle Bay. And the sawmills of the New Meadows faced stiff competition from those in Brunswick and Topsham along the Androscoggin River. Also, and we shouldn't forget, residents living in the more rural western portion of Bath, having grown tired of paying taxes that went to fund new roads, police, and fire station services in the urban center, voted to establish a separate municipality in 1844. That left farming and fishing as the major sources of livelihood for those who chose to remain in the new town of West Bath. And not everyone did. In the US Census for 1850, the first to be conducted after West Bath became independent of Bath, the population of Bath stood at 8,020, while in West Bath it was 608. A decade later, in 1860, Bath's population had grown by 56 to 8,076, while Bath's population had declined by 208 to 400. And by 1900, the year when Emma Raymond's novel was published, West Bath's population had dropped to 291. Little wonder that both she and the unnamed writer of the 1939 newspaper article that I quoted from earlier harked back to a more distant past for signs of a golden era on the New Meadows. And yet, confounding this sobering assessment, we also have Isabel Condon's warm recollection of pleasure boating, picnics, and shore dinners on the river around 1910, suggesting a sort of renaissance, another high tide in the economic and social development of the New Meadows River community. Beginning around the 1880s, it began to cultivate a new identity as a vacation destination, and not just for residents of Bath and Brunswick. The New Meadows was not alone in this transformation. All along Maine's coast and inland lakes, private summer cottages, hotels, and campgrounds increased as improvements in transportation made them more accessible to city slickers in Boston, New York, and beyond. By the turn of the century, ease of access via automobile, trains, trolleys, and steamship services drew the New Meadows River community into a larger network of economic, social, and even cultural activity. So thorough was this statewide transformation that in 1936, Maine's license plates began sporting the nation's new slogan, Vacation Land, right? To get a better sense of how these developments impacted the New Meadows River community, let's follow an imaginary Portland family on a weekend getaway around 1900. Now, since the family doesn't own a car, they hop on a trolley, and 2 hours later, they reach their first stop, a place called Merry Meeting Park in Brunswick. Eager to promote and to cash in on the tourist boom, Merry Meeting Park was developed by the Lewiston, Brunswick, and Bath Street Railway Company in 1898 on the site of a former shipyard and sawmill along the banks of the Androscoggin River. It featured a casino, a dance pavilion, an amphitheater, a pond for boating, and miles of wooded paths. It even boasted a zoo where the children of our imaginary family could marvel at buffaloes, moose, elk, black bears, foxes, monkeys, eagles, and rattlesnakes. Now, after spending the day at Merry Meeting Park, our family boards another trolley for the short ride to their next destination, the New Meadows Inn, located on the eastern shore of the New Meadows River in West Bath, where they will spend the night. The inn was built in 1898, the same year as Merry Meeting Park, near the main Central Railroad bridge and adjacent to the electric car bridge, making it accessible on foot, by horse and buggy, and by train and trolley. Private boats could tie up at the inn's float, and excursion boats from Portland stopped there. The inn's legendary shore dinner cost 50 cents at a time when clams were 15 cents a bushel. On Sundays, the inn might serve as many as 800 patrons. The following morning, our imaginary family purchases tickets for a leisurely sightseeing cruise down the New Meadows River to Small Point on Casco Bay. After an early shore dinner, they can transfer to a coastal steamer for their return to Portland. During the 1940s, New Meadows residents and vacationers encountered a new form of transportation on the New Meadows Lake. As fellow West Bath Historical Society member Jim Brophy, who unfortunately couldn't come today because he's snowed in, but as he explains in a recent issue of our newsletter, the lake was created in the early 1930s by blocking the river itself through partially damming and installing a large culvert to construct a short causeway between Brunswick and Bath at the point where the New Meadows Marina now sits. If you've driven along Old Route 1, you know where I'm talking about. Now, in 1941, 21-year-old Henry Donnell of West Bath was named chief pilot for Airways Incorporated of Waterville. He was stationed at the company's seaplane base at New Meadows Lake, where he ran a school to train seaplane pilots. The company also had a contract with the US government to train pilots for the Army and Navy at the airport in Brunswick. Donnell was followed in 1949 by another West Bath resident, Leon J. White, a Marine Corps pilot in World War II, who opened the New Meadows seaplane service. A newspaper ad for his company read, quote, "Plane available for student flying, rental, and charter. Solo $7, dual $9. By the time the seaplanes arrived, the New Meadows River community's notoriety as a vacation destination had plateaued. Ironically, at the same moment when Isabel Congdon was reminiscing about the good old days in the Brunswick Record. Merry Meeting Park in Brunswick had closed after just 8 years in 1906. The last of the steamship companies that plied the New Meadows River folded in 1918. Alonzo Fischel Jr.'s popular Riverside store at Foster's Point, which opened in 1912, selling groceries, freshly baked bread, and ice cream, closed in 1926 as car ownership increased and shoppers had the option of driving to Bath or Brunswick. The automobile also claimed another victim as trolley service between Portland, Brunswick, and Bath was terminated in 1937, the same year that the New Meadows Inn succumbed to fire. Although, as Liz Armstrong reported at last year's Town History series, her family operated its own establishment under the same name from the early 1940s to the early 2000s. The gradual shift in this latest economic tide was also felt by members of the New Meadows Yacht Club, which was organized in 1947. As reported by Carrie Nelson, the club's location was bounded on the east by Mill Cove and on the west by Back Cove and offered deep water anchorage. Members came from as far as Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. Overnight accommodations were available to visiting yachtsmen in the wood-paneled clubhouse. The club regularly hosted dances, clam bakes, and spaghetti dinners, and its annual 4th of July chicken barbecue drew hundreds of people. The club offered sailing lessons and, of course, weekend races on Winnegans Bay, as well as the Basin Cove to Cundy's Harbor area and out of Foster's Point and Small Point. However, membership gradually declined by the early 1960s, and the club disbanded in 1962. In the decades since then, the vacation industry along the New Meadows has matured, let's say. Gone are establishments like the New Meadows Inn and most of the campgrounds, while cozy seasonal cottages are giving way to seasonal and, in some cases, year-round million-dollar homes. Before closing, and I am getting to the closing, I will hazard an answer to the looming question, namely, does the New Meadows River community live on today? I imagine that many people who reside on or near the river, including yours truly, identify with the river in a visceral way. And there's enough activity on the river to remind us that it continues to be shared by residents on both sides. From my house overlooking the New Meadows and Howard's Point, I can watch the Bowdoin College crew team during its 5:30 a.m. and 4 p.m. training runs. I can see lobstermen checking their traps and hear the clammers roar by in their Florida-style airboats at low tide. And I can watch fishermen haul in nets, shimmering with their catch of alewives. Pleasure boats, too, are anchored along both shorelines in summer, but most of those who venture out on the water do so independently, just as I do in my kayak. There seems to be little to connect or bind us together as a riverine community. That is, with one exception, thanks to the humble oyster. Public demand for this mollusk has made oyster farming a growth industry along the New Meadows River over the past 25 years. Just ask David Hennessy, who presented a mouth-watering presentation for this Town History series back in 2015, during which he described how his family entered this business on Mill Cove beginning in 1995, leading to the incorporation of Winter Point oysters 5 years later. I apologize in advance for the grainy iPhone photos here, which don't do justice to the number of oyster farms. One can see just where I'm standing on Woodward Point in Boston. Of course, there looks like a nascent farm in birth here. Over on the West Bath side, if you could see with a better photograph, is a thriving oyster farm. And if you turn to the south, now looking toward Harpswell, you'll see again another well-established oyster farm in this cove. It's really quite remarkable. My most written accounts of the development of oyster farming in Maine never mention the history of its history on the New Meadows. The Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center dates the industry's beginning to the 1970s, when, quote, companies in Blue Hill and on the Damariscotta River pioneered oyster aquaculture in Maine, unquote. But Samuel Tibbets would have objected to that claim. The May 20th, 1840 edition of the Lincoln Telegraph carried an advertisement for Mr. Tibbets' establishment on Front Street in Bath, which guaranteed a constant supply of fresh oysters because, quote, he keeps them planted at New Meadows, and by this means is enabled to furnish a superior article, unquote.
There's a new topic.
Throughout New England, native stocks of oysters were depleted by 1800. Concern was so great that in 1821, the year after it achieved statehood, Maine passed a law that sought to protect its oyster beds and limit harvesting. In 1849, the legislature went further, passing a law to encourage and protect the planting of oysters. There followed numerous private, municipal, and county-wide attempts to farm oysters in coastal waters, but none of them succeeded. Which brings us to the pioneering role played by the New Meadows River. The April 3rd, 1906 edition of the Bath Daily Times reprinted an article from the Boston Herald titled, quote, Maine oyster attempts to cultivate the toothsome bivalve here. New Meadows success best. Citing the famous shell mounds deposited on the banks of the Damariscotta River by Native Americans as evidence that the Pine Tree State produced oysters by the millions in early days, the article describes a series of experiments that were conducted to determine whether oysters could be successfully reintroduced to Maine's waters. The experiment consisted of planting 10 bushels of oysters in 4 carefully chosen locations. For obvious reasons, the Damariscotta River was regarded as the most promising, yet ironically, it was singular failure when all 10 bushels inexplicably disappeared. One suspects they were stolen, but nevertheless. 2 other sites, the mouth of the Saco River and the mouth of the York River, showed more promise, although experts voiced concern that fertilized eggs at these locations might succumb to a sudden chill. It was the 4th experimental site that drew the most optimistic assessment. Quote, at the place of selection on the New Meadows River near Bath, conditions are the most promising of all. The tidal flow is not so great, with the consequent reduced danger of a sudden chill for the spat, while the saline deposit and food properties of the water are fully equal, if not superior, to that of the other places where the seed oysters have been deposited, unquote. Unfortunately, the Bath Daily Times never ran a follow-up article on the outcome of this experiment, not to mention any subsequent efforts to jumpstart Maine's oyster farming industry in the years that followed. However, 4 years later, the November 18th, 1910 edition of the Brunswick Record carried a short article about, quote, 6 enterprising Bath boys who visited the Sheepscot River and secured about 100 fine oysters from the beds there and took them to the New Meadows and put them in a place where oysters should increase. And they are hoping that the experiment will turn out all right. If it does, they will have demonstrated that oysters may be raised on the New Meadows, and others will follow their example. And perhaps in years to come, New Meadows oysters may be as well known as those which come from Chesapeake Bay, unquote. Now, it took another 6 decades after those boys' experiments, but in 1968, 5 bushels of oysters were planted in the New Meadows Lake in an experiment financed jointly by the town of Brunswick and the Maine Department of Sea and Shore Fisheries. Aquaculturalist and Brunswick High School biology teacher, Claude Bonang, with help from high school and college students, had by 1972 grown the oysters to marketable size. So this is considered by state sources as the first time that marketable oysters were successfully cultivated in Maine. Now, it took another 45 years before Mr. Bonang's breakthrough led to today's thriving oyster industry on the New Meadows. And along with it, perhaps, one hopes, a revival of the New Meadows River community through this establishment of the New Meadows River Shellfish Cooperative, whose 10 members share the greater waters of the river from Small Point Harbor in Pittsburgh to Princess Point in Brunswick. I'll conclude with its mission statement, which reads, collaboratively growing the highest quality shellfish on locally owned farms that promote ecological sustainability while respecting the shared usage of the New Meadows River region. Thank you. Keep in mind that I've only lived in West Bath for 4.5 years. Go easy with me on the question. I have a few more veterans in the residents in the audience who I hope will save me. Yes.
So I was looking at the picture of the seaplane.
Yeah.
He was training women?
Yeah. Yeah. According to the photo.
And were they working, then going on to work?
You know, that's just it. There's really very little information that I've been able to come across. And what I have was really thanks to Carrie Nelson, our archivist, for the most part. I didn't have time covering a lot of other topics to look deeper. But yeah, it would be interesting to find out, right? And that was remarkable about that photo.
Yeah.
Is to see that, you know, that he was training women at that time. Yeah. And it seemed like it was really rather loose. I mean, the one on the right with Mr. Leon, it was touting the fact that his prize student had soloed in about 8.5 hours of wow, I'm not sure I would sign up for his maiden flight. But I mean, it was kind of I'm sure the technology was simpler then. And so, you know, and obviously the rules and regulations we have now with the FAA are so different that it probably was a fairly simple thing. If you remember back to the days of the, you know, the biplanes that were, you know, the crop dusters, as they call it out in the Midwest, you know, where basically the farmer owned his own plane and somehow figured out how to fly it. It's maybe not that much different. Yeah.
Although then women were on the tops of the plane.
Yeah, acrobatics, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gary.
So the idea that the communities were centered around the river would correspond with when the waterway was the more accessible form of transportation as opposed to roads and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah, no doubt about it. That's why that map that I showed, again, barely discernible from a distance, showed you the you know, the gradual growth of roads in and around Bath from, you know, 1760 on up, because, as you said, that was secondary to being able to hop in your boat and you know, travel that way, right? And again, it's just really following what the Native Americans did. Yeah. That's a very good point.
Interested in the section that you were talking about with building the fortresses, the homes
Yeah.
that other families could
Mhm.
go,
Mhm.
could like hunker down in.
Yeah.
Was there any subsequent like treaties between the Indians and those who had settled there, or did the Indians just leave?
No, that's a whole other topic, and it's been extensively researched by historians. In fact, one of the first books I read that really got piqued my interest in that topic was a book written by a young assistant professor at Bridgewater State University down in Massachusetts called Properties of Empire. And he looks at the really interesting history of treaties between Native Americans and European colonists. And he takes the view, which I think is a fairly recent development, that these Indian treaties, I mean, for the most part, historians have treated these as basically just pieces of paper that, for the most part, the Native Americans didn't even understand what they were signing away, and were used as a convenient excuse, backed up by military force, for the colonists to be able to simply move in and grab the land for themselves. He said that those Indian treaties were actually central even to the Pejepscot proprietors in being able to argue that they had legally acquired these properties because the people from whom they acquired them had made recognizable treaties with the Native Americans. But of course then eventually what does happen is that through these series of wars in which, for a variety of reasons, the numerical advantage that the Native Americans had at the outset disappears, not only because of the wounds of war, but also from disease, means that eventually, by the end of the 18th century, from the mid to late 1750s, by that time, and of course the number of European colonists or American colonists had increased to such a point that the advantage that the Native Americans once had disappeared. And so at that point, then you do find that more and more, even those in places of government and the legislature in Boston, were willing to dismiss these treaties. Yeah, but it is a very interesting history, and there has been something written on it if you're interested in looking at it. The book I mentioned is actually in the Patent Library.
Oh.
Yeah, Ian Saxine is his name, Saxine, and it's called Properties of Empire. It was just published within the last year or two. It's a very, very good book if you're interested in that. And as I mentioned, interestingly, Isabel Congdon wrote a 21-page booklet on Indian tribes of Maine, which I read. You can see it online through Internet Archive. And she does a really respectable job of walking you through these different wars. And she tries to focus on the Indian tribes here in this area. So you can look at that as well. Yeah.
Imagine the disappointment when you spend 2 years and all that manpower or hand digging a canal from the Merrimack to the head of the river, and then you didn't check the tide tables.
Yeah.
It's literally 3 hours difference.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah,
You go up to the mouth of the Kennebec and the Merrimack Bay after Chops Point.
Yeah.
Compared to Howard Point, it's 3 hours.
Yeah, I've often wanted to walk that trail. I haven't really found it yet, and I think that the Kennebec Estuary Trust used to that photo.
I haven't seen them do that in a while.
Yeah, they used to take winter
winter
tours of
Yes.
that. It would be
Yeah.
very interesting to have a look at it. Enterprising to be sure. Probably one of the few failures that Mr. Peterson suffered. He sounded like he was, as I said, a very successful entrepreneur in every other respect. Yeah.
The creation of roads and culverts replacing bridges and ferries must have changed the ecology of the river. Was there concern about that at the time, or?
Yeah, I didn't come across one historically, but there was, again, when you start looking at the history of the New Meadows River, there was a major scientific report published in 2000 that was taking the measure of the river. And it tries to go back throughout history to see what's happened. But in that period, other than, again, this general concern that throughout, all along up and down the coast of Maine, one of the detrimental effects was that we've lost our oyster beds. And can we even get them back? So that must tell you at some point this concern began to kick in. Yeah. Yes.
I have never heard of the Winnegans River. Are you talking about the creek that goes from the village of Winnegans back south?
I don't know. I am reading literally what the official, this was the official plea from residents along the Kennebec to the general court. And this is how it was worded. And I didn't have time to stop and try to map this out, but I was running that myself. Why don't they say the Kennebec River rather than the Winnegans River? And the only thing I can think of, and this is kind of a lame, way out, is that the names of these rivers changed. Even the Kennebec River, which we now assume, begins at Moosehead Lake and flows all the way into Casco Bay. But the point between the Chops and Merry Meeting Bay and Casco Bay was for a while known as the Sagadahoc River. And it was north of Merry Meeting Bay that they called it the Kennebec River. Now, I don't know whether this was a mistake or whether they are actually referring to that creek. Doesn't sound like it. She said 3/4 of a mile. And of course, we know that they're talking about crossing the Kennebec River to get to Georgetown's, a place of worship. So I have to say I was scratching my head at that too, but I didn't have time to stop and try to investigate. I was just literally reading verbatim what the official proposal to the colony of Massachusetts was to allow them to separate, well, not separate entirely, but to create a second parish. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to that question. Yeah.
You have Winnegans Bay on the New Meadows side.
Yeah.
You have Winnegans Creek on the Kennebec side.
Right.
And Winnegans means a short carry.
Right.
And it's just so unusual. And
Yeah.
and the road now is called Indian Carry.
Yeah, I kind of know what you're talking about. Yeah. That's why I was perplexed by it, and now you're forcing me to go back and try to find it because I won't be able to sleep at night. But yeah, it is curious. The reference to the Winnegans River specifically. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
The other thing that's interesting is if you look at a late 1800s chart of the Kennebec River.
Yeah.
And the chart looks like what we all grew up with, except for it's black and white rather than yellow and what have you. It has an old Indian carry on it, even in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah. I think I showed one map that shows still it's Stevens carrying place. They were still referring to that in the 18th century as well, right? Yes.
The other thing, back to the oysters.
Yeah.
I think there may be about 12 oyster farms now on the New Meadows.
Mhm.
And because there's not much pollution there,
Yeah.
they're highly regarded.
They
And
are.
they're almost as good as the Damascotta River oysters now. Or maybe.
Showing your
say-
prejudice.
Reed, the New Meadows are better.
That's what you're gonna have to have, an oyster off, right? So you just make sure.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the co-op, I looked this up on their website to make sure the numbers were current, is currently 10 companies. I did happen to notice that David Hennessy's Winter Point Oysters is not a member of the co-op. So there's number 11 at
Yeah.
least, and there are probably others, yeah.
Does the town of Phippsburg have a farm or something in the basin?
Yeah, again, you're asking someone who's new to West Bath, never mind Phippsburg, the answer to that question. Maybe there's somebody from.
There are oysters in the basin.
Yeah.
There is,
There are oysters being grown in the basin.
okay, okay.
I don't know.
I think Terry,
I have a close friend who's on the DMR board, and there's sort of a minority opinion that we need to bring back overboard discharge.
what? No, not me.
I didn't say you, but this is how
I'm
I
pointing at you, but.
Yeah, that we needed to, feed the clams.
Oh, God.
Yeah,
feed the
yeah,
oysters.
yep.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's what they're doing in Chesapeake Bay now.
And in Potomac.
Not by choice, but yeah, if you read about the recent pollution of the Potomac River, gives you pause before asking for a blue crab or something, I think, yeah. Any other questions? Easy questions? Real easy questions?
So
Yes, Deirdre?
I know there's a lot of boat builders and experienced people in the audience, so I don't know if this is kind of a rudimentary question, but the city of ships and the boat building was so prominent in the city of Bath. I
Yeah.
was actually surprised that
Yeah.
there were boat builders
Yeah.
on the New Meadows. So I guess kind of, why did they choose to be on the New Meadows? Was it just being able to have a tract of land, or, and were they competing with the city of Bath and the boat builders there?
Yeah, I wondered about that too. It might have been accessibility of land, and also, I guess depending on the kind of boats you're building. I mean, you know the swift current of the Kennebec River, and of course the great virtue of the Kennebec River shipbuilding is that long reach there. It has this nice gradual sandy shoreline, missing the rocks that we associate with Bath, and it's 40 feet deep at high tide right out there. So I know this from having volunteered at the Maritime Museum a couple of years back. And being a tour guide there. So, you could, Sam Percy and Frank Small could launch these, 300 plus foot mammoth 5, 6 and 4, 5 and 6 mast schooners there, because at high tide it was 40 feet deep, and they could just slide down in traditional fashion there, right? I guess I'm in a better position to answer the question why it moved and why it was located there in the first place. Because this is a saltwater embayment with tides of 6 to 10 feet, it's a relatively shallow river compared to the Kennebec at long reach. And so when I was looking at some of the statistics that I found about these early ships that were built there, their displacement is really rather modest. 6, 10 feet, maybe 12 feet, The Wyoming, the largest commercial wooden-hulled vessel ever built in North America, had a draft of 27 feet. So, they simply could not have launched ships of that size off of the New Meadows. But it's a very good question. I hadn't really thought of it, is why did Lamont opt to start his shipbuilding? And really, some would argue that start the shipbuilding his industry in Bath itself, on the New Meadows rather than the Kennebec. I don't really know. Yeah.
I think a lot of it is the actual moving of the logs. Is that, especially if there are no
Good point.
roads. You'll see a lot of shipyards that lasted 20 years.
Yeah.
And they probably took all the trees that were accessible and
Right.
they moved somewhere else.
Yeah, no, that's true. They could. In fact, one of the things I said as a tour guide was one of the attractions of the Kennebec was that you could cut timber after the area had been denuded nearby, and simply ship them down the Kennebec. Another interesting, fact, neither here nor there, is that the masts used for those large ships were actually what they called Oregon pine, now known as Douglas fir. Where does it come from? The Pacific Northwest. So they would ship it over on these special train cars, and the depot in Bath was, as you know, right in the center of town, and they would simply unload them in the river and then float them down to the Percy and Small shipyard there. So that is a very good point. Now, it had Peterson's Canal worked out as he had hoped, they could have simply brought them down from the Androscoggin, but that wasn't, as you said, that wasn't the case. Yeah.
It should probably be noted that most of the smaller shipyards just simply evaporated because the smaller lumber was gone. It was deforested by the turn of the 18th century.
Right.
Or
Right.
1800s, say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just, because they did ship all that lumber south in staves down to the islands to trade for other goods.
Yeah, and then,
It was clear cut.
I did mention in passing, of course, the demands the British had, for the best, straightest, tallest pine, which the king marked with his special insignia.
Rivers. you know, whether it was
Yeah.
Saco or the.
Yeah, so, and then as I said, it was just it was a thriving source of income for people who had few alternatives. You could always cut down timber, even if it didn't belong to you, and make a profit off of that, so, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Professor, where do you